They don't call it the state line, they call it the Indian line. And why? Until 1854, Kansas was all Indian territory, so they were well aware that they would soon be leaving the United States. Moving south from there, the next notable landmark is actually in somebody's yard. That depression right there is the trail. It's at the corner of 85th and Manchester. This is the Wiedewelt family. They donated this piece of land to the city of Kansas City to maintain as a park, and you can see there's a little interpretation there, but it's probably close to 100 meters long. Unfortunately, right across the street, the Blue Ridge Baptist Church a number of years ago decided to build a large soccer field that took away about half of that remaining wagon swell, but the Wiedewelts were good enough to donate that piece. South from there, you come to the old Hickman Mill School District. This property is currently up for sale. We do have it fully developed with a hiking trail through the area, a lot of signage. You probably see these steel silhouettes along I-435. They're also here at this property. There's interpretation there as well. And then moving west from there, right above where Bannister Mall used to be and Benjamin Stables, where now the Cerner or Oracle buildings are located, is Schumacher Park. It's got a tall grass prairie. There's a lot of interpretation there. There's a Daughters of the American Revolution monument there from 1909. They've been marking the trail for well over 100 years as well. I mentioned earlier that as we build out the hiking, biking trail through Kansas City, this is the bridge over 435 at Bannister Road. It's called the Powder Mill Bridge. There used to be a little dynamite factory on the other side. There's a Home Depot there on the back side of that. Moving south and west from there is Hartgrove Creek. And this is a really notable place. This is a pretty well-known campground. That building there in the background is the new police station there in South Kansas City. It's just off Hickman Mills Drive. And you can visit that site, and I'll read you a quote from Hiram Miller. And Hiram Miller was with the Donner Party. They did camp here their first day out of independence, the night of May 14th, 1846, and he writes, "Camped at Hartgrove, Jackson County, near the Indian line, 20 miles from Independence on the Big Blue." So it's 1846. They don't call it the state line, they call it the Indian line. And why? Until 1854, Kansas was all Indian territory, so they were well aware that they would soon be leaving the United States. Down at Red Bridge Road, just east of Holmes, if you cross the new Red Bridge, next to the old Red Bridge that's still there, you come to this just about 6-foot deep depression. I've stood in it. It looks like it's just over my head. I stand 5'9", so I'm guessing it's about 6 foot deep. That's another one of those early Daughters of the American Revolution monuments. But if you walk across that field, you'll see a whole series of wagon ruts. They're pulling up out of the Big Blue River right there, and they're dragging a ton of water behind them and then gouging out that hill. And of course, it gets quite muddy, so people are moving to the left and right. There's just a whole series of wagon ruts. In fact, continuing on to the golf course there, over closer to Holmes Road, the Santa Fe Trail Association actually just got the wagon ruts through the golf course marked. So if you play golf there this spring, be sure to look for our signs that show you the trail going through the golf course. And of course then, the last town in the United States until 1954 as you're heading west is New Santa Fe. This is kind of near 123rd and State Line, about a block in. There's a little cemetery there. There's also a wagon swale that runs right through the cemetery there. Another great site. I think I do have I have a quote about New Santa Fe as well. This one is from William Johnson, April 28th, 1849, and he writes, "At 6 o'clock, we reached the frontier line of Missouri. Here, alongside the farm of a Mr. Lipscomb, we encamped, and by permission, used an enclosure near his barn for confining our animals." End quote. New Santa Fe wasn't incorporated until the 1850s, but Dabney Lipscomb, the landowner he mentioned, was already promoting business interests in that area in the 1840s. So when the Blue Ridge crossing of the Blue River became the primary route around 1840, trail travelers crossing the state line in the vicinity of New Santa Fe would have engaged with the people there. I've seen some people refer to this as a major outfitting town, and I don't think it ever was. I could ask this guy. He doesn't think so either. This guy knows more than me. He should be up here giving the talk. I'll introduce him at the end of this talk. But that wasn't the case. The village was a place where some supplies and services could be procured, mostly blacksmithing or liquor. People like to, especially across the line, where the people you weren't supposed to sell liquor to, a lot of people were. But you could buy that there. And this, block later, you're in Kansas now. Moving west from there, actually, I should mention who this guy is right now, because I think he's kind of the reason that we have a Lone Elm Park. Right here in the front row in his chief's garb is Ross Marshall. Ross is a past president of the Oregon-California Trails Association. He's been my mentor for 21 plus years. In fact, the very first trail trip I took across Nebraska, I did it with him. And I'm very pleased that you're here. Thank you. But he's told me the story that he knew this private ranch was coming up for sale, and he went to the Olathe City Council thinking it would be nice to set aside maybe 40 acres for a park. And I think the city set aside, 400 acres for a giant park. There's soccer fields and everything out there, including interpretation and a shelter house. And this is a really, really important campground on the trail, and hundreds of thousands of people probably pass through here. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes to give you the flavor of what Lone Elm Campground was like. James Josiah Webb writes in early September 1845, "The first night from the state line we camped at the Lone Elm, and there came up a violent storm in the night, and being too short-handed to form a guard to herd the cattle, we concluded to go to bed, keep dry, and trust to luck. Awaking in the morning, we found every animal gone, and hunting the tracks found they had started for the States. There was no way but to follow them on foot, and I started alone, leaving Mr. Doane to look after things in camp and see that the men did not leave, taking an outfit for which they owed, and as much more as they might be able to carry. Arriving at the state line, I found the oxen and as much more as corralled by Mr. McGoffin, who I mentioned earlier, his major domo at this camp, and the mules yarded at French's. There had been a great deal of rain, and the roads were very muddy and the prairie very soft. I went to the camp of Mr. Noland, who had hitched up to start, and found him putting a new tongue onto one of his wagons. It had been the first wagon to make the start over the prairie and had mired down. And doubling the teams to pull it out, the cattle took a short turn and brought the wagon on the lock and broke off the tongue." So it was originally known as Round Grove. Finally, only one tree remained, probably around 1849-50, gave it the name Lone Elm. Of course, that tree's long gone, and now there's thousands of trees out there, none of which would have existed in those days. And moving west from there, the last really major notable site on the Independence Route before the trails separate is Gardner Junction. And 21 years ago, this was the very first project I worked on with OCTA. At the time, it was just a little gravel road pull-off on Highway 56, about 2 miles west of Gardner, with a wildly incorrect Kansas State historic sign that had a lot of stuff that wasn't true on it. But we worked with MoDOT and the state of Kansas and some others, especially the city of Gardner, and built this nice little park, which until recently did have native tallgrass prairie. They've decided it's way too hard to maintain, so they're going to just do regular grass. But you do have other tallgrass prairie like at Schumacher Park that you can explore. We recently just refreshed the signage there. It was 20 years old. The sun's baked it pretty good. Brand new signs are out there now, so you could go and enjoy that. But I want to mention a few things about Gardner Junction. A pretty famous mountain man named James Clyman wrote there in May 16, 1844. "About noon today, we left the Santa Fe Trace. These are two of the longest roads that are perhaps in the world, the one to Santa Fe and the other to Oregon. Doubled teams nearly all the way. Both teams swamped down and had to unload our team, breaking an axle tree." So we kind of refer to this as the eye of the needle. Pretty much everybody that's leaving Kansas City, whether on the Westport route or the Independence route, is going right through here. Just to the west of this site, maybe a quarter mile or so, is actually where the trails part ways. And Santa Fe Trail, the next major place you'll see are the Blackjack Ruts, which you've never been out there. I would highly encourage you to visit them. They're even deeper than the ones in Minor Park. And then the other trail kind of heads towards Lawrence and Topeka. With that, I'm going to jump back up to the Westport route. So this 1840 map depicts Choteau's Landing. I mentioned earlier that the only Anglos really living in the area around 1820s were at Fort Osage, but also the French down here near the mouth of the Kaw. And of course, right across from the Randolph Bluffs, which is kind of between 435 and 35 along 210, those big bluffs, he was probably located opposite that. We don't know exactly where. This is a map drawn that shows the 26 French Catholic families who were living here in 1840. You can see they're all along the Missouri River. This is the Kaw or the Kansas River, and they're all down here in what was called the French Bottoms. Now we call it the West Bottoms. And this is the plat of the town of Kansas, so the River Market area just to our north here. This is how it was originally platted out. So by 1870, you can see that Kansas City's grown quite a bit. You can even see this competing city over here called Wyandotte, soon to change its name in 1886 to also Kansas City, which causes those of Kansas City no end of grief. Why is Kansas City, Missouri named after the state of Kansas? And I always tell people, well, Kansas City, Missouri existed first. The people in Kansas stole the name. Actually, it's all named for tribes. We all know that here locally, but it is confusing to people from around the country. I live in Missouri, and they always assume I live in Kansas. You can see there that Westport is still a distinct city unto itself. They wouldn't merge until the 1890s, and Kansas City continued to just creep south. This is an 1881 map that still shows 5 distinct towns, places like Argentine and Armourdale and Wyandotte, all merged together in 1886 to become Kansas City, Kansas. So this is what it probably looked like. William Henry Jackson was painting after the fact. William Henry Jackson worked on the trails across Nebraska a lot, working as a teamster. He was also a really good artist. Hundreds and hundreds of his paintings can be viewed at Scottsbluff National Monument in western Nebraska. The National Park Service owns most of his paintings. This is his depiction of the town of Kansas, or Westport Landing. And this is a photograph from the earlier. This is the Gillis Hotel. You can still see the foundations of some of these buildings. If you walk down the town of Kansas Bridge, right now would be a good time. The foliage should be gone. You can look back and see some of the foundations. There's some interpretive panels out at the end of town of Kansas Bridge that will guide your eyes to see what used to be there. And of course, where are they going? They're going down here to Westport. We know this as Kelly's. Many of us have probably had a pint or two there in our time. And next door is Bridger's. Kelly's was originally, more famously known, it was built by the Ewing brothers, but really became associated with Daniel Boone's grandson. He had a trading post here, and he owned the other half. He eventually sold this half to Jim Bridger, whose son ran it. Today it's Kelly's and Bridger. They're probably the 2 oldest buildings in Kansas City, Missouri, probably both built about the same time, around 1850. This picture shows, Westport. This is the corner of Pennsylvania and Westport Road, and this is a more modern picture. This Bridger's has been painted white. I was down there about a week ago. If you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see a video that Chip and I made there talking about early Westport, and you'll see that it's white now. And then these 3 guys are there at the corner of Broadway in Westport. Alexander Majors, of course, one of the 3 founders of the Pony Express, John McCoy, who plotted out Westport, and Jim Bridger, probably one of the most famous mountain men, whose farm was down around 435 in State Line area to the southeast of that, where the hospital and Quick Trip. There's actually, if you go to Quick Trip, directly behind the Quick Trip, there's a large historic marker. On one side, it'll tell you all about Bridger and his farm, and on the back side, we'll have a map of the farm. He was originally buried along Indian Creek down there, but in 1904, he was moved out to Independence at Mount Washington Cemetery, where you can find him today. Of course, I'm going to back up, because I'm not quite done with Westport. I've got a few quotes to share with you about what Westport and Westport Landing were like back in those days. Maybe you'll say not much has changed. So Francis Parkman, who wrote a pretty famous book about the Oregon Trail in early May of 1846, wrote, "Early on the next morning we reached Kansas, or the town of Kansas, about 500 miles from the mouth of the Missouri. Here we landed, and leaving our equipment in charge of my good friend Colonel Chick, whose log house was the substitute for a tavern, we set out in a wagon for Westport, where we hoped to procure mules and horses for the journey." And then he writes of the town of Westport later that day. "Emerging from the mud holes of Westport, we pursued our way for some time along the narrow track in the checkered sunshine and shadow of the woods, till at length, issuing into the broad light, we left behind us the farthest outskirts of the great forest that once spread from the western shore of the Atlantic. Looking over an intervening of bushes, we saw the green, ocean-like expanse of the prairie, stretching well beyond swell to the horizon." So you can see, even by 1846, Westport is the edge of civilization. All those beautiful trees we have down there now didn't exist then. Moving on, in 1843, Matthew Field writes, "Started an hour after my friends to go in advance to Westport. My mule, with a dozen others, couldn't be found, which delayed me. Caught up with the others in an hour, now on the Santa Fe Road, and soon after met a subordinate officer from Fort Leavenworth, going out to Colonel Cook at 110 Creek with a wagon load of corn. Just after this, 20 miles from Westport, Elizabeth Jenkins gave out, and I was compelled to walk and lead her, letting my companions leave me behind. Remembered well one of the spots I passed this morning on the Santa Fe Road, found a hole of water, and let Elizabeth crop dry grass while I wrote up a journal. Afraid I shan't see Westport today. Met a young military man alone, whom I afterward learned was Sergeant Griffith of Dragoon Company G. He gave me information of my friends on the road, besides a dram of whiskey, and I walked. 2 miles further, met more military men with a wagon load of corn, and stopped with them as they were tramping, and it was still 10 or 12 miles to Westport." W.P. Tomlinson writes in 1858, in May, "I took a walk out to Westport and proceeded from thence to the plains of Kansas Territory, where the Santa Fe trains were encamped in corrals on the prairies. I went out to the Santa Fe Road to Westport, and then followed the old California road until I came to where the corrals dotted the prairies set apart by the United States government for the special benefit of the Santa Fe and Oregon trains. It was a beautiful view, the great prairie, over whose rolling swells, covered with waving grass and variegated with a profusion of beautiful flowers, the herds of 100 corrals were grazing or lying idly on the velvety sward, while on every eminence was the picturesque corral of the trader, from which would momentarily dart some Mexican, Indian, or half-breed, mounted on pony or mustang to visit some neighboring encampment. Then the vast herds of cattle feeding far and near over the prairie, the white tents and wagons of the immigrant and far-traveled Santa Fe trains with their Mexican teamsters. So I threw in a term there, I quoted it, half-breed. It's obviously kind of a derogatory term today, but it was the common nomenclature of the day. It was a half-white, half-Indian person, for those of you who don't know. Moving on into Kansas. Obviously the Shawnee Indian Mission is when the Indian removal starts, a number of churches come and set up missions all across Kansas. This one is one of the better preserved ones. I know there's a bit of issue with making sure it can stay open and who exactly runs it. I know some of the local tribes have been brought in to discuss this, and hopefully they'll get to help interpret their people's times there as well very soon. This is kind of a really special place in Kansas City. A lot of people aren't even aware that it exists. This is where the first major wagon train left the Kansas City area. This was May of 1841. I mentioned earlier John Bartleson. His name's come up a few times. He was one of the founders of independence. He lived down in the southern part of Jackson County as well. He was a bit of an older guy. Seemed like a tough character to get along with, but he insisted on being the captain of this wagon train. And then John Bidwell was a really young guy. When he gets to this area, he's about 20 years old. He tries to stake a claim up near what's now Weston, Missouri. His claim gets jumped, and he decides, I'm going west to California. There were some people in California writing back regularly to the newspapers in Missouri, wanting more Americans to move out there because California at that time was still Mexican, and the politics being what they were, the Americans were afraid maybe their ranchos would get taken from them. They thought if they could just get more Americans to move out there, they could solidify their property primarily, but also solidify California eventually for the United States. So Sapling Grove Park there at 82nd and Grant in Overland Park, Kansas is where all of these folks rendezvoused, and they're heading west with Father de Smet and Thomas Fitzpatrick, a famous guide. And so when you hear, and we almost all learned this in 4th grade, independence is the beginning of the Oregon Trail, and it is, but so is Westport, and so is Sapling Grove. There's some interpretation out there that you can see today. There's the 3 panels that are there, so I highly encourage a visit there in your travels. A little beyond that, you get the Elm Grove Campground. Earlier I mentioned Lone Elm, and there was a lot of confusion between which was which, and used to be a local historian that lived here. He's retired and lives in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. He actually spoke here a few months ago, Craig Crease. He just wrote a book about Wild Bill Hickok. But he's the one that kind of figured out the mystery of which one was Lone Elm, which is southern Olathe, and Elm Grove, which is more western Olathe. So here it is. I've got a couple of quotes about this place. The first is Richard Wilson writing in June 2nd, 1841. Giving the slip to a couple of days just at sunset on the 2nd, we descended a precipitous declivity to a place of which nothing remained but the name of Elm Grove and one solitary logan of a stricken tree to mark where an elm grove had been. A beautiful rivulet bubbled forth from the base of the hill, and as we wound our way down, we spied a single campfire of an old Mexican hunter. So later, the Bidwell Bartleson party would come through here. Everybody going to Oregon in 1843, the first major wagon train west would go through there. The Mexican War, pretty much everybody marching from Fort Leavenworth would come through here. But a really, really famous, or I should say infamous thing also happened here in 1842. In 1842, Elijah White leads the first wagon train that had more than 100 people over the Oregon Trail to Oregon. He'd first gone to Oregon as a missionary for the Methodist Church in 1836. He first sailed to Hawaii, then up to Oregon, and he set up a mission along the Willamette River with Jason Lee. Trapper and later politician Osborne Russell served as guide to this migration, and the party set out from Independence on May 16, 1842 with 112 people, 18 wagons, and a variety of livestock. Along the journey, some of the migration grew wary of White's leadership, and L.B. Hastings was selected as a leader. That would be the infamous Hastings cutoff, which is a completely other story. It's part of the reason why the Donner Party wound up in the fix they were in. But he was with this wagon train as well, and he was selected as the leader for a time until the party split into two groups. The party would eventually cut their wagons down to two-wheeled carts at Fort Hall in southeastern Idaho and arrive at Fort Vancouver in September of 1842. But while the Elijah White party is camping there, now keep in mind, they're just in what's now Olathe, Kansas. They haven't been out of the United States for very long. But there's a diary quote from one of the guys that was with the wagon train. It's kind of a curious diary quote, and he writes, "A violent rain this morning, much excitement in camp about dogs. 22 dogs shot. Stopped raining about 9 o'clock. Well, that piqued my interest. I had to know a little bit more because I have my own trail dog. That's Jimmy Choo. Jimmy Choo's almost 6 now, but he's been up and down the trail 20, 30 times. Santa Fe Trail, Oregon Trail, California Trail, Lewis and Clark Trail. This is my trail dog. And I would never dream of allowing him to be shot. And as you will see from some of these other diary quotes, other people weren't super thrilled with this decision either. And I should preface this by saying there was a concern that with all the dogs that it could bring in wolves, it could bring in unfriendly Indians. These are greenhorns. These are people that have never really experienced the West before. So they get it in their head that they probably ought to kill all their dogs. And one of the women, Mrs. A.J. Allen, writes, "Here, by a 2/3 vote, it was determined to kill all the dogs of the company, having been informed that, in crossing the mountains in their vicinity, these animals were apt to become rabid, as timber was scarce, and consequently water, which they so much required in the heats of summer on the scorching plains. The arrangement did not at all accord with the feelings of the ladies and caused the first serious disturbance since leaving the States. While the destruction was going on, the poor creatures would run to their mistresses for protection, crying most piteously. Even the men, while engaged in their task, found their hearts were not sufficiently steeled to permit its performance without feelings of sorrow and regret. However, the recollection of a freshly related account of the mad wolf, which had bitten 11 of the 2 encampments, strengthened their fortitude. The death of the dogs was preferred to those of their herds and perhaps members of their families, and they went resolutely about the work, amid the cries and screams of the women and children, as well as the victims." Hubert Bancroft, of course the famous Bancroft Library in California is named for him, wrote a book called The Elijah White Party. And he writes, "At this point, White startled the company by officially recommending that all the dogs in camp be forthwith killed, lest they should go mad upon the arid plains which they were now approaching. King Herod's edict anent the slaughter of the innocents could scarcely have called forth a louder wail of lamentation from the mothers of Judea than was evoked from the women and children of White's party by this proposed immolation of their canine pets and companions. Many of the men, too, protested loudly against the sacrifice. Although when it came to a vote, most of them yielded to their leader's wish, yet the measure was so unpopular that it contributed largely to the election of Lansford Hastings as captain at the end of the month." And the final quote I'll share about this comes from a W.G. Gent, or W.G. Gent. "The immigration of 1842 really begins the epic of the Oregon settlement. It was a party of divergent wills, and it had a stormy time. There was evidently too many dogs in the party, and at a meeting it was resolved to kill all of them. They would all go mad on the plains, it was argued, and even if they didn't, they would be sure by their barking and growling to acquaint any prowling Indians with the fact that here was a party to be plundered. The counter-argument that their barking would also apprise the immigrants of the presence of Indians did not apparently carry sufficient weight, and a motion was passed that all the dogs be shot. Medorham Crawford in his journal and Miss A.J. Allen, the author of the book of White's Travels, say that the dogs, a total of 22, were killed. Hastings, however, says that the motion produced a great deal of ill feeling, that after a few were killed, another declared that any man attempting to shoot his dog would himself be shot, and that as a consequence, the execution stopped then and there. And Jimmy Choo would have lived to see another day, because I would have been one to shoot whoever tried to shoot my dog, for sure." So the next major stop on the trail out here comes a little later. The Mahaffey Stagecoach Station didn't open, or it wasn't built until 1858. This actual house wasn't built until 1865. But by then, the Santa Fe Trail, your post-Civil War era, becomes a transportation corridor for stagecoaches. And they do have a nice stagecoach out there that you can ride. It's there, a really nice part of Olathe. The city's done a great job maintaining and interpreting that. But I'll read you a quote about Mahaffey. This is from Emma Morley, autumn 1864. "There was a mixture of society who needed or wanted to travel. Public houses, inns, taverns, hotels, wayside rests, stagecoach stops. Any of these offered similar services, but ranging greatly in quality and scope. Newly settled frontier regions were always in need of public houses. A Kansas country tavern is a great institution. Do not think we shall ever forget our night at Paola. It makes me shudder to think of it. Not only bed bugs, but rats were our roommates that night. Such a hornpipe as these rats danced on the floor around our heads everywhere. Long, tedious night. We thought morning would never come. October 19th. Left Paola before daybreak, rode 6 miles and stopped for breakfast. Asked one of the passengers. He told us we'd get the best meal here of any place in Kansas. Found we'd been rightly informed. Everything was clean and palatable. Enjoyed our breakfast. So you can see the accommodations in Olathe were a lot better than the accommodations in Paola. Any of those from out that way can rub it in. But the beginning of the end is the coming of the railroad. 1869, Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad begins construction. By about 1870 or so, they've reached the Kansas state line. By about 1874, they're in Pueblo. By 1880, there's a spur that it'll take you right into Santa Fe. So it's kind of the beginning of the end. The trailhead for the Santa Fe Trail continues to move west with the railroad, which is largely being built in the corridor of the Santa Fe Trail, or right on top of it in some cases. Wasn't really the case as the Transcontinental Railroad was being built in 1869. Historians have looked at that. People continued to jump off of the Missouri River in their covered wagons and head west from there. But this is really the beginning of the end. The Hannibal Railroad Bridge here. This is from Harper's 1869, a depiction of the opening of the bridge. And you can see just from the opening there on the left in 1869, look how much the city grew in the next decade. As was mentioned in the introduction, yeah, the trails helped build Kansas City, but the railroad really helped make it a mega metropolis. In fact, I've got some maps that calls it Centropolis. I'll close with this. John Calvin McCoy really set it up nicely. He mentions Berenice Choteau. She was kind of the grande dame of Kansas City in those days. The period of time from Berenice Choteau's advent until now marks an era of history, an era of transformation and development over more than half the continent, such as we may safely say the world has never witnessed before. Thank you very much, and go Chiefs.